Salvete omnes, this is I'm Amelia, also known as the Martian Geek, and once again, it's time to talk about the game. So, Kaze and the Wild Masks. What is there to say about it? Honestly, I think the commentary during the Let's Play speaks pretty well for itself for this one. Of all the games that I can think of, this one might have the biggest difference between how positive my opinion of it was at the beginning and what my opinion was like by the end. It started out so promising. What happened? That was a rhetorical question. I know very well what happened. I can pinpoint the exact level that was the beginning of the end. I wasn't expecting it to be perfect. Every game has flaws. Some have a lot of little ones that add up, some have a few medium ones, some basically have one big one, and some have a nice assortment of problems of all severities. I could also have another axis for how much of the game the problems affect, and one for how good the rest of the game is. This game, though, I would put in that third category. It would be quite good indeed if it didn't have one major thing that absolutely cripples its potential for enjoyment, and that is the sheer number of running levels. I never liked having to run away from stuff in video games, and this game has way too many instances of that. In a typical platformer, including all of the Donkey Kong countries, these are the types of things that you might see in a couple levels, but a very clear minority of them. In this game, the number of levels where you're constantly running, getting chased by something, trying to outrun a rising hazard, or otherwise not allowed to take the level at your own pace is ridiculous. Past a certain point, it feels like you're doing that crap more often than not doing it. Let's tally them up, shall we? 2-7, running automatically with the lizard mask. 3-1, running away from an anglerfish. 3-5, running away from a tornado. 3-6, running away from rising toxic waste. 3-7, on a constantly moving platform. This is probably the least offensive of them. 3-8, running automatically with the lizard mask and running away from an anglerfish. 4-1, running away from rising lava. 4-2, running away from a tornado. 4-4, running automatically with the lizard mask. 4-5, running away from an anglerfish. 4-6, running away from rising toxic waste. 4-8, on a constantly moving platform. 4-9, i.e. the final freaking boss, running away horizontally, vertically, and with a lizard mask. That's 13 levels out of the 35 total, or about 37%, and it's 12 of the 18 levels in the last two worlds. 2 freaking thirds of the second half of the game have at least one of these gimmicks. It's also 11 out of the 27 non-boss, non-secret levels, or about 41%. You know why World 1 is the best? Because it doesn't have any of this garbage. People complained about the number of rocket barrel and minecart levels in Donkey Kong Country Returns, justifiably so, at least where World 4 was concerned, but both of those together still add up to fewer levels than there are chase and auto-run levels in this game. Depending on how you count them anyway. They're tied if 7 are counts, there's one more if the last boss counts, and there's one less if neither count, so the number is comparable. But keep in mind this game has significantly fewer levels than that one to begin with, 35 compared to 71, or 31 compared to 63 if you don't count boss levels, or 27 compared to 55 if you don't count secret levels either. So basically, this game has twice the density of chase levels that Donkey Kong Country Returns has rocket barrel and minecart levels. Admittedly, I didn't really mind the minecart levels. For the most part, they felt like a reasonable change of pace, where you could see what was coming and react accordingly, and if you screwed up, there were multiple checkpoints to go back to and you could do something different next time. The closest thing this game has to them, however, are the lizard mask levels, and those, by contrast, feel like a frustrating exercise in trial and error. Not only does it quite often feel like you can't effectively react in time to the obstacles that you're approaching unless you already know what's coming, there were a few cases where I wasn't even sure what the game wanted me to do until I'd gone through the section a few times. The end of 4-4 comes to mind with all the bananas. And if there's one occasion in video games where the player shouldn't be required to try to figure out what to do, it's when they're constantly moving and have to react to everything quickly. What with the gimmick level overuse, it practically feels like I'm playing Wrath of Cortex again. Granted, this game still isn't as bad as that one in that regard, but man, if Pixel Hive wanted to make one of those stupid one-button auto-run or mobile games, maybe they should have done that. There are some levels, like 3-1, 3-6, and 4-1, that only involve getting chased for part of it, but I feel like it taints the entire level anyway. Like, when I say animal antics, are you more likely to think, oh yeah, that level where you turn into all the animal buddies, like Rambian and Garden stuff, that one part sucked, but the rest was fun, or, that stupid bramble part, that was awful. Probably the latter. Now, outside of that big smelly stain on the game, what's the rest of it like? Well, I didn't really like the secret levels either, but I think at this point I've just resigned myself to the fact that secret unlockable levels in games will never be good, not as long as people fail to understand the difference between challenging the player in a fun way and just getting on their nerves, or think that having no checkpoints in a level is a legitimate form of difficulty. They were shorter than Tropical Freezes, which is nice, but the fact that I'm glad that these levels are giving me less content to play should be a red flag. The bosses are tricky, but mostly fine, aside from the last one, which basically embodies all the worst traits of the game. My favorite boss was probably the third one, though it did take me way too long to realize that you don't need to climb the walls to dash over the ground level enemies in phases 1 and 2. While I was planning on discussing my favorite and least favorite levels, I decided against it, because the latter would probably just be a matter of choosing which two auto-scrolling levels annoyed me the least. And for that matter, the former would just be choosing which two regular levels I didn't like as much as the others. My least favorite level in the game, though, well, it's almost certainly either 4-4 or 4-5. 4-4 was trial and error incarnate. It's extremely easy to die and get sent back, and I mentioned the last banana hopping section being annoying to figure out. Naturally, it's almost right at the end of the level, thereby ensuring that you'll have to redo a bunch of it and possibly die again before you finally get another shot at that section. It's one of those that mainly comes down to muscle memory, but to the point where eventually you start slipping up on the parts that you already know perfectly well how to do because you're so bored of having to repeat the same things again and again. 4-5 might be the objectively worst level in the game. It's easier than 4-4, but it's one of the more blatant examples of gimmick reuse. We already had the lights and the crabs that react to them in 1-6, we had the anglerfish in 3-1, and we had both of them together in 3-8. There really is no reason for this level to exist. It having two of the most obtusely hidden secrets in the game doesn't help in the least. 4-2 is kind of the same way. It's less annoying than those last two, but it's literally just 3-5 without the tiger mask. Well, literally in the sense that it's the exact same concept, not that the actual level design is identical, of course. They didn't have that many levels to design in the first place. Did they really run out of ideas that easily? On the other hand, my favorite level is probably 4-7. Yes, my favorite and least favorite levels are only 2 or 3 apart, go figure. It has an actually pretty decent gimmick to it, if you can call it that, which makes for some good platforming challenges. It also has good music, easily my second favorite level theme in the game after Burning Pumpkins. It might even be my favorite, actually. I don't know what it is about lava levels in video games, but they always seem to have the best music. Some other pretty good levels are 3-3, 1-5, and 2-4. How about the presentation of the game? The graphics and music were basically fine. They were not as good as Donkey Kong Country's, I'll say. Aside from a few particular tracks, the music was decent, but not all that memorable. Even most of the ones that were catchy when listening to them, I couldn't tell you much about what they sound like. The game looked quite nice. The graphics weren't pseudo 3D like they are in Donkey Kong Country, just standard 2D, but it worked just fine. The best looking environment was definitely the grassland. There was one thing that I felt both the graphics and music suffered from, though. It felt like the different themes didn't have very clear identities. The fact that there were only 4 worlds didn't help. They had to cram a lot of level themes in wherever they would fit, sometimes even if they didn't fit. World 4, in particular, really doesn't have an overarching theme as a result, and if it was intended to have one, I don't know what it would be. It could arguably be the lava world, but there were only 2 levels that actually fit that, along with 2 desert, 2 dungeon, and 1 toxic. 3 had a clearer theme, but I didn't feel that it was enough to design an entire world around. When you only have 4 of them, Toxic Waste is an odd choice. 1 and 2 mostly did stick to their theme, with a few outliers like 2-5. If we look at the individual levels, though, things aren't that much better. The main issue I see is that the graphics and music aren't used very consistently sometimes. In most 2D platformers, with a few exceptions such as the really early Mario games, each possible level theme has one particular tile set and one particular music track, or maybe one of 2 music tracks for different variations, or maybe a unifying track for levels with a particular gimmick like the minecarts in Donkey Kong Country 3. It might have 1 to 3 backgrounds to choose from too. In this game, there isn't really a one-to-one relationship like that. Some of the levels stick closely to particular elements, like the ice and lava ones, but others really don't, especially where music is concerned. There are a few cases where the same music is used for very different levels. Probably the most standout example is the track used in 1-2, 1-5, and 3-3. Other than the music, those 3 levels don't have much in common. I also noticed that the bramble obstacles showed up oddly frequently. In Donkey Kong Country 2, they were their own level theme, but here they get used in everything from desert to lava to ice levels, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does seem a bit strange to me. I think this game might have benefited from clearer delineations of its themes and environments. Overall, Kaze and the Wild Masks is decent. It's a game that definitely had potential, but didn't really meet it. Yet another one of those, I should say. I see that the whole game that should have been great ends up being merely okay because the cool and interesting ideas they had didn't make up for poor and frustrating design decisions thing is even affecting indie games now. The standard platforming levels were mostly good. Like I said, the main problem was that it just had too many levels that were effectively auto-scrollers. If they'd cut those down by a good 70% or so, it would have been fine, and it would have left more room for other things. The game also feels fairly short for being released in 2021, only 35 levels counting the 4 boss ones. The original Donkey Kong Country only had 40, so that's not ridiculously short, but it does kind of leave me wanting more. If they ever made a sequel, and I certainly hope they do, they could not only iron out the kinks, but also make it bigger and grander. As it is, though, the game may be inspired in many ways by Donkey Kong Country, but an adequate spiritual successor to Donkey Kong Country it ain't. You know, this is the second game I've played that tried to be like Donkey Kong Country and ended up being clearly not as good as Donkey Kong Country. What I wouldn't give for an actual new Donkey Kong Country game. Please, Retro Studios, just finish Metroid Prime 4 already. I don't even care about that game, I just want you to move on to something else. Honestly, what are most of the game studios even doing nowadays, considering how many series are getting huge gaps between new entries? But that's a discussion for another day. This game is worth playing, I would say, just don't expect something amazing. And with that, that's all for this one. See you next project!